Good morning.
We should be honored to have Highlight's presence today because it's very early. She had to get out of bed very early this morning for this. So
I didn't even have a coffee yet, so I'm in middle, which, I'll get there. But we're missing our third partner, which is nice. I don't have to deal with him today.
Yeah.
So not having my dad here makes it easier for me this early in the morning.
You have more elbow room.
Yeah, exactly. And also like the idea of dealing with him this early and would be hard. So this works for me.
Well, I guess I know what the clip for this episode will be.
Oh God!
It'll be
great,
that.
Great. Yeah.
But the good thing is that we've replaced the loss of your father's intelligence with somebody else.
That's true.
Keep the IQ on the podcast high.
That is true.
So our guest this week is Paul Hanebrink, who's a professor of history at Rutgers University. So welcome to edJEWcation, Paul.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just to let you know, Jay and I pretend we're smart, and Jay does a better job than I do. So just thank you for being here so that we can have no, you do a good job. You could pretend well, but thanks for being here so that we can actually have someone who has something intelligent to say. We appreciate it.
That's right. Exactly. So a few months ago, I read your book, A Spectre Haunting Europe, The Myth of Judeo-Bolshevism, which is his right here. And it's a terrific book. But before we talk about the book and why I read it, could you just give a little bio of yourself and what your interest in Eastern Europe and Judeo-Bolshevism comes from?
Yeah, well, it comes from being, I guess, originally and still a historian of modern Hungary in particular, Eastern Europe generally as a region, but Hungary specifically. I did my dissertation on a topic in Hungarian history. It was a book about the relationship between anti-Semitism and religion and nationalism in Hungary. And I was looking at the idea of a Christian nation in the Hungarian context. From doing that work, dissertation research, and then transforming the dissertation into a book, I, really sort of began thinking a lot about why so many people in Hungary, but also not only there, in many other countries as well, kept coming back to this idea that there was something specifically Jewish about communism, and that was uniquely problematic or uniquely threatening to their particular notion of what the national good was. And so I became interested in that topic. Just sort of where does that come from? How does that work? What does that mean? Why is it so persistent? Why could I find it in materials from the 1920s and then also read it in newspapers today? That was really the impetus for wanting to write a book that began with thinking about Hungary, but as you saw when you read it, it's not only about Hungary. It tries to put things in at least a European context, if not a little broader.
Wow. Do you have a familial connection to the region?
I have some family connection to Austria, but none, in fact, to Hungary. I became just fascinated. I mean, I was one of those people who went to college right after 1989, when Eastern Europe seemed to be the center of the universe, and I had the great good fortune of taking some courses in Eastern European history with an amazing Hungarian professor named István Deák at Columbia University, and he sort of launched me on the path.
Excellent.
Did you write your dissertation on Eastern Europe?
Yeah, the dissertation is on Hungary. It's on this idea of this notion that sort of was generated in the years right after World War I of Hungary as a Christian nation, and who was advocating for that and what they meant by it, so that's what the work was about.
Awesome,
fascinating.
Awesome. So I'll sort of give a quick background of how I found your book. So there's, you seem probably too smart to spend too much time online, but Haile and I spend probably a little too much time online. And in the last, year and a half or so, there's been these people who have sort of just discovered all of this history. and one of the things that you've seen popping up online is this concept that the communists were Jews, or that Bolshevism was driven through Zionism or the religion or whatever. And I've, Haile and I have read a lot about the history of communism and the history of the Soviet Union, but this is an area that's a little more esoteric. It's a little more niche-y. And so when you go and try to find information about how true is this, there's not a lot out there. You see sort of the people saying Marx was Jewish, which he was, and people saying Stalin was Jewish, which he wasn't. But beyond sort of those very basic things, there's not a lot of information on the topic out there. So I found your book, and I have to say it was incredibly illuminating to give the truth of this Judeo-Bolshevism relationship and where the myth comes from. And so I guess let me just start there and ask you, have you seen these provocations, these sort of faux historians online who are just sort of creating this history almost on the spot about this relationship? And what are your thoughts on that, if you have?
Well, it's interesting because, you're right. I don't know that I spend too much time trawling the internet today, but what is interesting about what you're saying and what you're describing is just how very old it is. Like this has been going on forever. I could find you any number of texts from the 1920s that are doing the very same thing in a very analog way. And so, to me, what frustrated me was, and I think you're right to call it a kind of niche thing, is that it so often devolves into this question of how true was it. And so then we start counting Jews in the Communist Party, and we come up with a number. And then we have to have a second argument whether that number seems large to us or not, or disproportionately large, or disproportionately small. And I became very frustrated with the circularity of that argument that went nowhere. And it just seemed to be the kind of thing that, people could use to support whatever they had decided before they started arguing. And so, to me, a better way of going about it is to say, on the one hand, sure, there were, any number of people from Jewish backgrounds who became communists, and, what that might mean to them to be both Jewish and a communist is a very individual thing. Would have to be unpacked through biographies and, sort of a deep dive into that person's life and circumstances. But, the claim that there are too many Jews somehow always has a kind of function, like an ideological function. People say that because they want to advance some other thing.
Right.
And so the uses to which the idea can be put seems to me the more interesting question, at least to me, precisely because I didn't want to write a biography of a particular person or a particular group of people, which I think would tell me a lot about those people, but maybe nothing. I don't know how much it would tell me beyond that.
Right.
Sure.
That's interesting.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So your background is in Hungarian history. What drew you? I think you've written 2 books, right, correct? So yes. One is about Christianity in Hungary.
Yes.
And then this is your second book. What drew you to this topic, based on your background that's sort of very specific on Hungarian history and sort of just broadening your lens to a more of a general topic like this?
I think what struck me, and I mentioned this a little bit before, was just the kind of the ubiquity of this idea in political discussion, and not only in Hungary, but that's where I first encountered it. So I was, reading a lot of material from the 1920s that blamed Jews for. So Jews had Hungary had a series of revolutions in 1918 and 1919, and they had a short-lived communist regime in 1919, and there were quite a lot of people who basically said that was a Jewish plot. That had been a Jewish plot to destroy Hungary, and it was only through a kind of persistent and assertive Christian national politics that Hungary had been able to sort of bring itself back from the brink. So there was all of this material from that period, which then shapes the course of anti-Semitic politics through the 30s and then into the 1940s and the Holocaust in Hungary. And then there was a second kind of iteration of this, which sort of saw the Communist Party that took over after 1945 as being a Jewish plot, and they could point to sort of people in the leadership very early on who came from Jewish backgrounds as being sort of evidence of this. And then that seemed to bleed into a kind of very contemporary discourse about whether there was too much emphasis on the Holocaust among left liberals in Hungary who wanted to sort of see wrestling with the Holocaust as kind of a sign that the country was committed to, human rights and civil society and these kinds of things, and that there hadn't been enough focus on the harm that the communist regime had done to the nation. And so it just seemed like this sort of stacking and reformulation across the entire 20th century, in that with echoes into the present day, that really sort of caught my attention. I wanted to sort of know what was the engine for that, and is is there a through line, or is it all just simply repackaging?
Right.
So can you give us a little bit of a context, like how Jewish was the early Communist Party, and not party, but the movement? How Jewish was it really?
Well, I mean, I think that let's take Hungary as an example, since we started there. I think people did all kinds of studies that said among the sort of leadership position, there were a number of people who were from Jewish backgrounds. And, that can mean a lot of things. So the leader of the party, for example, was a man named Bela Kun. He did change his last name from Cohn to Kun. His father was Jewish, but his father, from everything I read, wasn't a real presence in his life. He went to a Calvinist high school, one of the best ones in Transylvania, in fact. And had excellent teachers there. And then he joined the Socialist Party, and he was a journalist, but he wasn't particularly radical when he was in the Social Democratic Party. And he became much more radicalized when he was in a POW camp in Russia during World War I. And so then the question is, well, what is it that actually is making him a communist? What part of that experience is it? And that's kind of what I meant about biography. You start to ask about a person, it's like, well, what in this story is Jewish, actually?
Yeah.
And that could vary a lot depending on person. But the other thing that I think we should also remember is that the communism was a mass movement, and so there have been, for example, studies of voting patterns in, let's say, Poland in the 1920s, and it turns out that most of the people who voted for the Communist Party, came from other ethnic groups. They were not, it wasn't like there was this block of Jewish voters voting for the Communist Party.
Right.
And so I always ask myself, well, let's if you flip it around and you start to ask questions like, well, we never say that like Erich Honecker was communist because he was German.
Right.
But we say that some people were communists because they were Jewish. And so then it seems to me that that there's something about the question that needs to be asked rather than sort of just immediately jumping to, well, let's quantify it.
That's such a good point, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been reliably told that just because you went through a Catholic high school doesn't mean you weren't Jewish. Because I've heard people say it's Stalin going to seminary was actually proof that he was Jewish because they were trying to hide his identity from a young age.
Oh God.
So, so in your research, what was the So is there an event or a place where this myth started and then sort of metastasized out from? Or was this just sort of an organic thing that popped up in different places around the same time period?
Yeah, I mean, I think I tried to think a little bit about this because I spent some time trying to figure out, like, is there like an origin point or an origin story to this?
Yep.
And, you know, the more you start to think about it, or the more I started to think about it, I realized that what we're really talking about is a kind of reformulation of the very old idea of a Jewish conspiracy. And you can find iterations of that there's a kind of a global or international or worldwide or geographically extensive Jewish conspiracy going back to the Middle Ages. So, you know, what's interesting to me is the way in which that basic idea of a Jewish conspiracy is repackaged and reformulated to meet a particular moment in a way that makes sense for that moment.
Right.
And so, you know, there are certain kinds of themes that are, you know, have very old roots. The idea that you know, in a Christian society, for Jews to gain power will lead immediately to a dystopia, that the world will be turned upside down, that social and moral order will collapse. You know, these are ideas you can find, you know, in many earlier time periods, but they really become the way that many people, and not only religious people, understand communism, that it is a dystopia. And the reason it is a dystopia is because it overthrows this kind of traditional moral and social order, and that somewhere in there's a kind of a Jewish presence. I think that, you know, rather than sort of thinking about it radiating outward from anywhere, what it seemed to me to do when I looked at 1918 was to be sort of simultaneously in a number of places. I mean, there's definitely a story coming out of the collapsing Russian Empire. But, you know, you can also find the same kinds of materials in the Catholic media in Western Europe. And they're that media is very conscious of what's going on in Russia, but they're not necessarily borrowing it all from there. And so I think there's this kind of, you know, feedback loop in a number of sort of right-wing medias in 1919, where people are looking at events far away and seeing in it confirmation of their views about something that's going on locally. And so there's this relationship between the local and the kind of the international that I think is a dynamic that really kind of contributes to its sort of, you know, flourishing and spread, kind of like mushrooms popping up in a number of places.
Right. It does seem like something changed after World War I. I mean, there was always anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe, but somehow maybe I'm misrepresenting it, but do you see that? Like between World War I and World War II, it feels like the countries in the Eastern European bloc just became far more aggressively anti-Jewish. Is that true?
I mean, I think, you know, some more than others. I think, you know, I think you're quite right that it was a real kind of watershed moment. I think it has a lot to do with, you know, the collapse of empires and the creation of states that are very nervous about their sovereignty. They're very nervous about their ability to control their borders and to sort of maintain their place, you know, on the map. And that kind of sovereignty panic, you know, really lends itself to concerns about traders within, and also, you know, things coming across the border. There is you know, in the aftermath of the collapse of the Russian Empire, there's a wave of Jewish migrants, which refugees, which just explodes this idea of sort of Jewish unrest seeping into the country from outside.
Right.
And then there's the example of communism, which is truly frightening to many people. And so there's a way in which those things, all kind of go together in different ways in a lot of different countries. This, fear of Jews from Eastern Europe is they talk about bringing the infection of communism with them. And so therefore they need to be deported. But, they're also radicalizing local Jewish communities. And so then there's this sense of these borders are porous and they need to be shored up somehow.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's it is interesting that you talked about the concept of Bolshevism being a disease, because that's sort of the common trope of amongst Jews, or I guess I'm not amongst Jews, amongst anti-Semites,
right?
Is that Jews are these outsiders that are bringing in some sort of an infection or disease to the community, whether that be literal diseases or whether it be sort of a intellectual disease, which in this case would be communism.
But it's interesting. I mean, this is just like anecdotal, but like I remember my grandparents telling us who grew up in Poland, very Hasidic families, that their siblings or cousins or neighbors who were becoming more modern and kind of leaving the fold of religion were often very attracted to communism and were joining, communist youth parties or whatever it was. You had kind of the Jews running to Zionism or many running to communism. And I wonder if the non-Jewish neighbors noticed that and maybe just transferred their hatred of, it was a perfect storm. You hate communists and you hate Jews, and here you have communist Jews. So it sounds pretty perfect.
It does. And also, the other thing that I think is there was a sort of a real sort of readiness in the media at the time was for Jewish communists to seem very visible. I mean, it was very striking, to people to see Jews in position of political power in Eastern Europe, however briefly, and in whatever numbers they were. And so to see that is some kind of sign that the world has really changed in some way. And so people would fix on that and assume that somehow Jewish power was everywhere, even if they're basing this notion off of having seen one or two people in their village or in their town. There's a sense of, well, it must be ubiquitous. And so I think, again, that visibility, is part of this question of, why are we focusing on the Jews who are communist rather than on the communist movement as in general, or other people in the Communist Party who are not Jewish. It's the visibility that is unsettling to people.
In the course of doing your research, was there anything you found that was particularly unexpected or shocking to you, that you just sort of made you re-examine what you believed about the situation or the history?
I think it wasn't so much that I was shocked to find something I didn't know existed, but I was quite stunned in a few places to find people speak so cynically about it, actually. So, I found a number of cases in which people, would be given data that said that, the number of Jews in particular positions of power in Communist Party didn't correspond to what they were saying, and then they would come back by saying, "Well, the data are wrong because the facts say this," And so there's this real, kind of, we know what the truth is, so we need the data to show us that the truth is true.
Right.
And similarly, I knew it, but I was even so quite found it remarkable that in the years right after the Holocaust, how cynical communist parties were in sort of playing on this idea in order to legitimate their own power, coming to power, how willing they were to sort of play on this. And that too was not a revelation, but it was something that made me sit up when I was reading through some of the materials.
That's interesting.
What do you think about all this kind of new history that's being revealed, about World War II, for example, and, these popular, I don't even want to call them historians, but people who play historians on podcasts or, on YouTube and, try to reframe what happened even prior to World War II and definitely during World War II. How do history professionals like you, someone who actually does research and writes books, how do you deal with that? Or how should we deal with that in our society?
Right. I mean, I'm not sure, I guess who exactly you're thinking of when you ask the question.
They're like these people like, what's their names? The people go on the Joe Rogan podcast, right? And there's a guy named Daryl Cooper who has a new idea of is that his name? Daryl Cooper? Yeah. Who has this new idea that, we got World War II wrong, right? And the Germans weren't exactly the villains that we make them out to be. And, he's being listened to by millions of people and sort of reframing how we view history. And I just wonder, as an academic, how do we deal with that?
Well, I mean, I think what I would say is that there's a kind of a particular path that I try to follow. I mean, on the one hand, I think it's important that history not be sort of the exclusive domain of professionals.
Yeah.
It should be. It should be the topic of public discussion. At the same time, I do believe the research matters, obviously.
Yeah.
And so that certainly makes it incumbent upon, those people doing the research to try to communicate what they've found and what they've researched in ways that are accessible. But then to insist on the fact that any conversations about, let's say, World War II, needs to somehow grapple with that research. And that what we can't do is just pretend like the research hasn't happened.
Right.
You may have any kind of take on the research, any number of takes on the research, but it is something that one must wrestle with.
Yeah.
And so that's how I think I would sort of approach it. But I mean, it has to be a kind of broad public conversation. And we don't want to lose that either.
Yeah, that's true.
For sure.
That's a good point.
There were a couple of things in your book. I just made some notes here that really, what's the right way to phrase it? Blew me away. Might be overstating it a little bit, but really made me rethink some things I thought I'd understood previously. One of the things that you wrote about is the fact that pogroms against Jews, in part, were almost like a political tool to unify political parties, and sort of create this. It's kind of like some companies go to camps and do trust falls, and some some people go to the escape rooms, and some people pogrom Jews, so could you talk a little bit about that and how it was sort of used as sort of a unifying event amongst some political groups to create cohesion amongst them?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I would say two things about that. And I write about this most extensively in the period right after World War I and sort of the collapse of empires in Eastern Europe, when there was this wave of pogroms that broke out. And, here I should also flag for your viewers or your listeners that if you're interested in a really deep dive into sort of the pogroms in Ukraine, there's a fantastic book by the historian Jeffrey Beidlinger called In the Midst of Europe, which is about that. So that's an excellent title for people to read. What I would say is two things. One is that, pogroms in particular places break out for any number of reasons. A lot of them have to do with, local dynamics. But one of the things that can very quickly become a kind of unifying, marker among people who are politically or socially divided in other ways is, an agreement around who the enemy is. And in this case, who are the people who are supporting communism? And so, people who might have disagreements about how to distribute land or how to do land reform or anything like that, can find common ground on this idea that indeed, Jews are the communists, and that is a kind of a common enemy. The other thing that I found, and this was maybe even more interesting, was that the idea of Jews having a role in communism became a very useful and for many people plausible way to justify violence after the fact. So that people if you really dig down into the pogrom, people whose real interest in the pogrom was taking stuff from some Jewish family's home, says after the fact, well, there was communist agitation. And so this was actually a kind of a rational political act that may have gone too far, somewhat excessive, but nonetheless, there was at the core of it a kind of a political rationality to it, because communism is objectively a threat, and this was an act of self-defense. And so that then becomes a way of explaining things to courts, to national media, to the International Court of Public Opinion, and often successfully, because people can then people sort of get into on the one side and on the other. And yes, maybe it was excessive, but on the other hand, there was some reason to it. And the fact that the thing that triggered it was somebody wanted, the silver, it gets lost then.
Right.
Do you feel like there's a parallel to what we're experiencing today with the anti-Zionism sort of movement across the West? Because I mean, just based on what you just said, I feel like that's very familiar. A common enemy for the far left, let's say. I mean, we could talk about the far right in a minute, but there's a common enemy. There's something to point to. There's something to justify, by saying Zionism is evil, and people often say this. We don't hate Jews. We hate Zionists. Like, I'm just curious if you see a parallel there at all.
Well, I think what I would say two things maybe. The first is that the idea of a Jewish conspiracy is something that is really protean in its forms, and so the notion of the Judeo-Bolshevik had a real kind of power in the 20th century, and it still has a sort of a place in kind of memory, but I think it's possible today to see the notion of a Jewish conspiracy spinning off into other directions now, as people talk about communism, but there's no communist party anymore to be scared of, and so right. The Jewish conspiracy takes on different faces for people who want to use that idea. The other thing that I think is true, and maybe this is from the other side of it, is that one of the things you saw right from the very beginning, even in 1919, was a real discomfort among sort of, for example, in Hungary, Jewish liberal organizations who were trying to sort of, defend Jewish civic rights in Hungary were very, very uncomfortable about the relationship between younger Jews and the radical left. And they, kept saying, your actions are endangering the community. And you're not acting in a Jewish way.
Right.
So I see some parallels in that too, the sort of, to what extent is radicalism being seen as either too Jewish or
right.
Not Jewish in a sense,
right?
As opposed to a political choice that somebody who is Jewish might make for any number of reasons,
right? Yeah. I mean, I work on a college campus, so we definitely have those conversations. Like which Jews are in the tent and which Jews are not, and what ideas are kind of allowed in and what are not. I mean, that's what the Jewish community is sort of grappling with right now, I think, here in the United States, which is an interesting question. But I feel like we should just do a little bit. We didn't really break down like just the thesis of the book. Like, can you just like kind of, I don't know, in a couple of minutes, just, I know I hate asking authors to do this, especially academics who spent years researching, but can you give me the Cliff Notes version of what this idea is?
Sure, I'll try. So, first of all, the definition of Judeo-Bolshevism would be, the idea that Jews as a group or as a collective are uniquely responsible for or sympathetic to communism, that they created it, and that they are using communist parties and communist movements and communist revolutions to advance their collective power. And that therefore any violence that may be done to Jews as a result of this is in a sense violence that they brought on themselves. So there's a built-in kind of memory there. And then what I wanted to do in the book was to look at how this notion plays out in politics at different moments in the 20th century. So I begin in the period, right around and right after, just after the Russian Revolution, and I try to address these questions of, is this the origin point, or to what extent does this build on or update or transform or transmute older versions of anti-Semitic conspiracy? And I also try to address this question of how do we think about, were they actually Jews, or is it really true? But Leon Trotsky was Jewish, wasn't he? So there. And then I try to follow it through, this moment of this, pogroms on the sort of framing of nation states in Eastern Europe in the early 1920s. The sort of moment of transnational fascism in the middle of the 1930s, World War II and the Holocaust, the takeover of the communist parties in Eastern Europe. I have a chapter on the notion of Judeo-Christian civilization in the West as a kind of counterpoint to this, and then ending up with debates about Holocaust memory, and why in debates about Holocaust memory, the notion of the Jewish communist keeps coming up as kind of an excuse.
Right. Fascinating. And your other book, you talk about Christianity becoming like a nationalist idea, right, in Hungary. Do you? Yeah.
So there I look at the ways in which Hungary has several Christian traditions, one Catholic and some Protestant traditions, and how they kind of came together on the idea that Hungary was Christian,
right? Yeah.
As opposed to Catholic or Protestant.
Oh, I see.
And that this had, there was a certain, for all of their disagreements about various questions, theological, confessional, intellectual, social, there was a sense that there was a Jewish question in Hungary, and that Christianity was somehow essential to addressing it.
That's fascinating. Yeah, go ahead, Jay.
So it's funny in answering the question about the pogroms, you actually brought up one of the other points I was going to bring up, which was that the violence, there was a post hoc rationalization of the violence in saying, well, we did it because they were communists. Yeah. And that was fairly shocking. The other thing I thought that was interesting that you talk about in the book, and I had heard the idea for years that Jews were disproportionately communist supporters. And when you look at the legacy of Judaism, and how many of the sort of the big thinkers of throughout history have been Jewish or Talmudic scholars and these types of people, it wasn't really that surprising to me that this revolutionary concept would be attractive to Jews in particular. But one of the things that you talk about that really surprised me is that in the voting for Bolshevism, Jews were pretty much in line or even underrepresented in the voting for the Bolsheviks. So I thought that was, I don't know if you have any other color to add to that, but I thought that was an interesting point. Was not only was this not a Jewish concept, it was actually in a lot of areas actually underrepresented amongst Jews.
Yeah, I mean, this gets down to my question, sort of what, if you start counting and come up with a number, like what makes for a large number? How do you decide that the number is large?
Right.
And, there are quite often at specific moments, you can find that in leadership positions in the party, you can often find a number of Jewish figures and then sort of say, well, that seems like a large number. And then, in time, especially in for example, Eastern Europe and in communist Eastern Europe, there's a real sense on sort of ethnicizing the leadership. And so over time, there's a real sort of drive to sort of replace, people from Jewish background and leadership position with those from the dominant ethnic group. But, to me, it's always a question of, well, so what actually makes somebody embrace A, radical politics, and B, what makes them embrace, that particular form? Because, there were plenty of people who were socialists but would never have wanted to call themselves communists. There were people who were radical Democrats and kind of suspicious of Marxism. So when you start really looking at individuals, you start to get all of these sort of nuances, and then this number that you had, which was very big and very sort of seemingly clear, starts to look a little bit fuzzier. And at the same time, I think if you think about Jewish communities across Eastern Europe, there are plenty of, there's other political choices, Zionism, Bundism, all sorts of, things that are not Bolshevism. There are people who are very religious and not interested in secular politics at all.
Right.
There are people who are in places like Hungary, quite a lot, who are 110% committed to being Hungarian patriots. And, you can say, well, they were disappointed in that over time, but nonetheless, it was a very real and felt thing at that moment. And so you have to conclude that being communist was just one of many choices that people had, and that at particular moments it looks very attractive to a group, maybe even a larger group, and then at other moments it doesn't.
I always find that Jews have to be extra careful about what they say publicly or who they side with. And we just had this thing happen a couple of weeks ago where a Chabad rabbi, an ultra-Orthodox rabbi, met with Vladimir Putin to thank him for something. I can't remember exactly what it was, or it was like maybe it was around a Jewish holiday. And there's an extreme backlash against that, right? And people look at that and they say, see, the Jews are aligning themselves with, Putin. And now all of a sudden it becomes the Jews are in bed with, whatever. And but the reality is that I understand that rabbi, right? That rabbi is protecting his community in Russia, right? He's a chief rabbi of Russia, and he has to deal with Vladimir Putin. He can't sit back and be like, oh, I'm anti-Putin. So I feel like Jews are often put into a space where we're forced to people want us to not act in our own best self-interest, right? And then it becomes all Jews feel this way. So I don't know. It's not like, this doesn't feel like history. It feels like it's actually happening again and again and again.
Yeah. I think the way I was sort of thinking about it a little bit more recently, and this isn't so much the way I put it in the book, but it's, just to sort of think about the ways in which it is possible at a particular moment for people to be publicly Jewish, whatever they understand that to mean for themselves. And, there's a real, in material that I look at, there's, precisely because of this discourse around, communism being a Jewish phenomenon, there's a real insistence on the part of, in Hungary, Jewish liberals, for example, to sort of say, well, we are Hungarian patriots first and foremost in public. We have our own, religious traditions, which we have in private, but we are for every Jewish communist, there are 1,000 Hungarian Jewish patriots.
Right.
And that's the kind of the sort of the line that they advance. And it, you can say over time it wasn't a successful defense strategy, but it was something that made a lot of sense to them, and that seemed to be a way for them to carve out for themselves a space to, for themselves within that national community in Hungary.
Right.
I think it's actually, the example you brought up, Haile, is really good, because I think, if I remember correctly, that meeting was right after Putin was able to secure one of the Russian Jewish hostages to be released.
Oh, that's right. That's what it was. Right.
So that brings me to another question, actually for Paul. I don't know if you have an opinion on this. If you don't, feel free to say it's a stupid question. But Jews in particular often get this accusation of dual loyalty. Mm-hmm. And I think, the example Haile brings up is the perfect example of that, where on the one hand, you have this authoritarian dictator in Putin, but on the other hand, you have the leader of the Jews in the country, and he has to do what's right for the Jews, and going up into Putin and spitting in his face, while it might make you feel good for a moment, is not going to have good ramifications for the community you represent, right? And everybody has multiple loyalties in their lives, right? But it's really only the Jews that's used as a cudgel against the Jewish community. Was this a trope that was used in your research in Eastern Europe, this dual loyalty trope, or did you not see that as much as just the Bolshevik myth?
Well, I think the one of the things that made the Judeo-Bolshevism so powerful was that there were real transnational ties of communitarian solidarity, among Jews. There was a real interest in Jewish communities as to how, Jews on the other side of the border were doing, especially if that border was new and there hadn't been one like 5 weeks ago.
Right.
Right.
And so, the fact that there is that interest across the border made it seem plausible that it seemed to give plausibility for in the minds of anti-Semites, that this idea that there's an international conspiracy might actually be true, because the international part is pretty easy to show.
Right.
And so
that's such a good point.
So that's the first thing. I mean, the other thing I would say is that one of the things that I noticed this in Hungary, but I think it's true of other places as well, that Jewish communities really wrestled with was the influx at particular moments of refugees from farther east. And so on the one hand, there's a sense of, well, these are, the quote unquote Galician Jews, or the poor, Jews from Eastern Europe who are, making us look bad. On the other hand, we have a kind of philanthropic obligation to help them in some way. And so there's a real sort of tension about how to do that in the most low key way possible, so that it doesn't get noticed, but at the same time, the care and the philanthropy can get to the people who need it. And it was always, it played up in discourse, in right wing discourse around this is where the dual loyalties come in, and it also then fueled a lot of, well, we need to sort of really check people's documentation. They might be, who's illegal, basically, to put it in modern terms, and it cut across families, because there were families who had their national, in Hungarian case, Hungarian citizenship papers in order, but their spouse might not.
Right.
I just
had. So then, yeah.
No, go ahead. Sorry.
Go ahead. Yeah. So that was, that was another way in which this kind of dual loyalty canard was operationalized in a way to sort of be used as a cudgel against Jews more generally.
I just had this thought come to my head, because this is something I think about a lot, this dual loyalty thing, because I feel conflicted in a way that is maybe uncomfortable for many Jews, being an American Jew, but also being like an Orthodox Jew, and also being a Zionist. And, I think about it, my kids, I have 4 sons, and we sometimes talk about, like, what happens if the United States goes to war with Israel? Right? Where do we end up? Right? Where do we put our loyalties? And I realized just now, as you were talking, that my real loyalty is to a people and not to a government, And so it complicates it. And I don't know, I'm not saying I don't have an answer right now. I'm just thinking out loud about what that means for someone who, I love this country. I love America. I feel very American. And I actually feel very like Jewish American in a way that's different than being an Israeli Jew or, a Jew from England. But at the end of the day, my loyalty is with the Jews around the world who might need me or might need our support, or I don't know. So it just, I think like the people who hate us, there is a thread there of truth about how, for some Jews, how they feel, like if Candace Owens heard me say this, she'd be like, you see the Jews really are not loyal to this country. But I don't feel that. I don't know. I'm torn about it.
It's interesting because you think about like Herzl, right?
Right.
And Herzl was absolutely committed. I am Austrian.
Right.
I will do everything I can to be Austrian. He joined the clubs. He hung out with the people. He wanted all the Jews to convert.
Yeah.
Because like, forget the stupid religion thing. Let's just convert. Right. We can all be Austrians. We can all be happy. And so he was as committed to leaving his Jewish identity behind as you could possibly be,
right,
and committing fully to the society he was desperately wanting to be a part of.
Yeah.
And then eventually realized that that's not going to be possible.
Right.
And so I think, that feeling, I feel like is I don't believe in intergenerational trauma. But
what?
I think that idea,
that's my whole personality.
I know.
My whole personality is that my grandparents are Holocaust survivors. And that's why I'm such a horrible person. I'm just kidding.
But I think in my opinion, this is not me being interviewed, so I'll give my opinion. People can do with it what they will. But it seems like that feeling based on our history is pretty well justified to have this, to have that torn belief system.
Feeling.
Yeah.
Wait, I have a question that I'm embarrassed to ask, but I'm just going to do it because afterwards I'll be upset that I didn't do it. So I don't care how stupid I sound. But Paul, could you tell me, what is the difference between Bolshevism and communism? Or are they the same?
Well, in the Russian Revolution, the Bolsheviks were a particular, party,
right?
That was Lenin's party, and so the idea of bringing them to power as opposed to one of the other parties out there was the Bolshevik Revolution. Once they're in power, and it's clear that the Lenin model is the way it's going to be. The sort of the word communism or the Communist Party becomes more general.
Okay.
And in many ways, actually, Bolshevism becomes a kind of slogan used mainly by anti-communists to sort of drive home the kind of brutality of it. So long after Communist parties are no longer using the word Bolshevik, you find anti-communists calling them Bolsheviks.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. No, I don't know why I feel smarter when I say Bolshevism, but I didn't know if there was any difference. But when I say it, I feel like I know something more, which isn't true. But anyway, thanks for clarifying that.
Do you teach this topic to students in your classes?
I do. I mean, as part of things, I don't have a class on this, and I don't teach a course on anti-Semitism because I have a colleague, Paul Hanebrink, who does that really so excellently. But it's an element in the history of the Holocaust, which I do teach because I'm convinced that it's a really important point in sort of generating the violence. And it's a point that I emphasize both in the histories of Eastern Europe that I teach and also in a course on the history of fascism that I teach, because I think that it's a through line across not every fascist party, but among many of them.
Oh, wait, I have to ask you about this. 1 second. If you teach Holocaust, I have a question. Like, where are we going wrong with Holocaust education? I know we could probably do an hour on this, but
I was going to say that's a whole other episode.
I know, but I feel like something went off the rails, and we're sort of like, I'm not sure what's happening. That even within the Jewish community, that students are like rolling their eyes or annoyed about even having to engage on the topic. I mean, how should it?
Do you find that?
Yeah,
because I have to say, I get roughly about 110 students every time I teach it. I teach it once a year.
That's awesome.
And I find that it's a mix of Jewish and non-Jewish students. And I find that actually the students are quite interested in the topic.
Oh, that's good. I think maybe it's an Orthodox Jewish thing. Like in my community, there's definitely Holocaust fatigue. And I don't know if it's because it's just we bang on about it a lot. I mean, rightfully so. I mean, but we come from a community where many of our grandparents were Holocaust survivors, and we grow up like hearing about it day and night. And I don't know. I'm confused about where to go with Holocaust education. And even I see here, I taught high school Jewish history for 12 years, and one of my topics was Holocaust. But even in the public schools here, I live in California, I feel like they do a very poor job of really explaining. And it's a hard topic, but there's something wrong with how we're teaching it. Maybe not at Rutgers, thankfully, but maybe everywhere else.
Well, I mean, this is very much on a different topic, but it's something that I'm quite interested in because I do teach it. I've taught it every year since I joined Rutgers in 2001. There's a way in which you can teach someone in a kind of rote and ritualistic fashion where you're sort of going over the same points all the time.
Yeah.
In a kind of unreflecting way. No matter, even if it seems very important, you're not doing it in a kind of reflective way, and that can, especially for students, can start to seem like the quizzes where you have to remember who was king of a country at a certain time, and you're sort of like, let's just go down, and then there's other ways to teach in which you say, okay, what are the things that you think you know about the Holocaust? And let's think about that. And what does some of the newer research say? And, does this challenge the way in which we're looking at it? Which I think still maintains the centrality importance of the topic for the students, but it allows it to seem fresher because there's room for an element of surprise, or surprise being the thing you didn't know.
Right. That's great.
It's so interesting you're saying that. Did you? This is going to seem like an odd question. Did you see the movie that came out last year, A Major Pain?
Which one
yes.
is that?
Not
a major pain. A real pain. A real pain.
A real pain.
Yeah, a real pain. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
What you just said reminds me so much of the cemetery scene. Yeah. When the tour guide's just rattling off the stats, and Kieran Culkin's like, can you just like make this human for a second and not just rattle off stats to us for a second? So I think that really kind of is a microcosm of what you were just describing.
It's funny you're saying that, because I always feel challenged when I take students to the Holocaust museums, and I've taken hundreds and hundreds of students over the years to the Museum of Tolerance in LA. I've taken many, hundreds of students to Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. And I really struggle there because it often feels like we built museums for the Nazis, right? And then it's almost less about the people who were lost. I mean, there's always beautiful exhibits about the Jews, but we spend 3/4 of the time, focused on the Nazis. And then by then the students are tired and annoyed and ready to go and hungry and tired. And then I would love to see a museum that's just about shtetl life and, what the richness of Jewish life was before the Holocaust. And then the tragedy of what happened in the Holocaust. I don't know. It's something I've been thinking about for a few years, but
I think there has been a shift. I've noticed it in my students, and I've also noticed it, I think, in the way I hear some people talk about it in sort of pedagogical terms, that when I first started teaching the topic, one of the driving questions was, how could the Germans do it?
Right.
And, I find that many of my students today are much more interested in how did the Jews experience it?
Right. That's great. Yeah.
And, so that there's much more interest in the kind of, the problem with individual stories is that each individual story takes a time to tell. And so I don't know how that fits into it. We have a 90 minutes in this building, and then there's a bathroom break, and we all hang out at lunch and and all that. But if you have a semester, you can build in time for those individual stories, which are end up being what the students remember more than.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I was just in Poland for the first time a few months ago with my family. And so I always say this. I mean, people who listen to the podcast know, I don't remember a time that I didn't know what the Holocaust was. That's how much it was a part of my growing up and sort of my formation of my identity. But going to Poland and experiencing, walking through the streets of the cities and seeing what Jewish life was like, it just drives home how tragic and how enormous a tragedy was, in a way that you just can't get from reading a number on a page of a book, And so it's very, very interesting. And then I'll say one last thing, and then I'll stop talking about this. But I think in the ultra Orthodox world that I come from, we've struggled to talk about the Holocaust in a healthy way because of the whole theology of, where was God? What was God doing? And that's been a really hard question for, I think, our teachers and parents and leaders to sort of address. And so I feel like from all the different corners, it's been hard to really grapple with what happened to most of our grandparents just, 80 years ago. So anyway, different topic for another podcast. But
as an extension of that, when you teach the students, I assume one of the things you teach them is that this anti-Semitism that became so significant in Nazi Germany did not start de novo, with them, and this is sort of an extreme continuation, but nonetheless a continuation of these concepts that had existed for a long time. Do you find that's news to the students? Did they understand that these ideas didn't start with the Nazis? They were just sort of the most horrific manifestation of them, or is this something that they sort of understood?
It's funny because the way I pick up the class and teach it, I don't know that I have a good way of getting their baseline coming into the class.
Okay, that's fair.
When I present it to them, they accept it. What I'm saying. And so that to me, I guess, is the most important thing.
Sure. Sure.
But I think what I try to emphasize is, to sort of, in a sense, you have to get to Germany very quickly, but you don't necessarily begin in Germany. I like to, sort of, begin, for example, with where I begin the book with the sort of the breakup of the empires in Eastern Europe and how all of these sort of ideas connecting Jews to communism and Jews to sort of threats to the nation, spill out in a lot of places and also Germany. And then, you can actually connect some of the things that the early Nazi party is saying and doing with some things that other sort of, far right or nationalist groups in other parts of Europe are saying or doing. And then from that, you can sort of say, and then in Germany, it takes this course.
Right. Right.
Because I think it's also very important to sort of, keep the history of the Holocaust embedded in sort of like a larger history and not have it sort of, be that it's the Germans and the Jews and it's taking place in Shoah land or something.
Yeah. Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
That's fun.
That's great. That's
okay.
interesting.
Wait, I have a last question. I don't know if Jay, if you have a last question, but what are you working on now? What's your next? Do you have another book?
I was just going to ask that actually.
Oh, good. I beat you to it.
You did.
Do you have another book in you, or what are you researching now?
No, I'm right now. I'm actually thinking about some of the ways in which anti-fascist sort of images of anti-fascism, especially after 1945. Did not permit sort of space for what we might call Holocaust memory. And the sort of the ways in which sort of Holocaust memory came to sort of supplant notions of anti-fascist struggle, both in Western and Eastern Europe, and as a way of thinking maybe about, because I kind of agree with your suspicion, that there's something changing in Holocaust memory, and I sort of, the historian in me wants to go to sort of, an older iteration of when it sort of takes for shape to sort of get a purchase on how it might be changing now.
Oh, that's interesting.
Interesting. That's very interesting.
Well, if you need a research assistant, let me know. I'm available.
Is there anything important about this topic that we haven't asked that you think we should have asked?
No, I really enjoyed this conversation, and I quite liked the way it just sort of, went where it went.
We're very good at meandering through discussions. It's kind of our MO.
Yeah, we convinced my father, who's a very Orthodox rabbi, to read Frankenstein so we can pull out Jewish themes from that book, and he was very, very suspicious to begin with, and then ended up loving it. And you can find interesting things in any topic. That's what I've discovered.
That's a great story. I like that.
Sure.
Yeah.
But is there anything you want to promote that you want
buy his books.
listeners to
Let's
check
go.
out? Yeah. We'll for sure link to your books in the show notes for sure. And anything else that might be of interest to our community?
No, I can't think of anything. I think the conversation was really just very stimulating. So thank you for it.
Thank you so much for doing this.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you very much. And we'll talk to you soon.
Okay, great.
Bye.
Thanks so much.